Hello and welcome to the Ventures of Land podcast, where I, George Atwell, attempt to learn all I can about conservation, ecology, land management, and hunting. Today on the podcast, I have Paul Cigan. He's going to talk to us about Oak Wilt and some of the issues that can come along with it and maybe some solutions as well. You want to kind of just give us your job title in a way?
Sure. Thanks, George, for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here. My name is, like you said, Paul Cigan, and I'm a forest health specialist with the Wisconsin DNR's Division of Forestry. So I work on a regional team, and I'm one of 6 of the forest health specialists that covers a specific region in the state. Mine is Northwest Wisconsin. The core of my area are 9 counties, including, Douglas, Ashland, and Bayfield, all the way down to Polk, Barron, and Rusk counties. So we cover everything on this job that's related to forest insect and disease pests, things like oak wilt. We'll talk today about emerald ash borer, spongy moth, spruce budworm, jack pine budworm, a whole array of both native and invasive insect and disease pests that threaten to undermine the health of the Wisconsin's forest.
Cool. Awesome. Sounds like you have a fun job.
Really exciting. There's a lot of variety to it. As I cover that large area geographically, there's different forest cover types. There's about 4 within the zone I cover: the jack pine sands, the northern forest, the boreal transition, and then the Lake Superior Basin. And so there's different forest species of trees, and each tree has a different array of pests that can affect it.
Do you do like a lot of like field work, or are you more based with like office type stuff? I'm also just curious because I'm looking into jobs with the DNR and stuff for like career paths. So that's a little bit more of a question that's just directed towards that. We'll get on to Oak Wilt. That's just a quick little side note question.
Yeah, I'm guessing your hopeful answer is a lot of field work, and that is the case in the summer months for sure. When we're in the growing season, over half of the time is spent in the field doing survey work or attending to landowner or forester calls where people might be asking for assistance, technical support with diagnosing an insect or disease problem on a tree or within a patch of forest, and then asking for management recommendations. So that takes a lion's share of the field work in the growing season. But then I also do field work in the winter too. Just last month, I had several site visits in December, and there's some more field work planned for January. So it's more office space in the winter, but I still end up getting out in the field. And surprisingly, I do get calls from landowners who are out snowshoeing or they're out doing wildlife management work, and they notice things even in the winter. So there's no time where I get hung in the office all month long.
That's good. So we'll just start off with a basic question. What is oak wilt? Like at its very core, like what kind of disease is it, and how does it like affect oaks?
Yeah, oak wilt is a fungal disease that kills oaks by clogging up their vascular system. So this is a disease that's been in Wisconsin since at least the late 1800s. It was first sort of thought to be documented based on some government land office records that date back all the way to the 1890s. But it was formally described actually by a Wisconsin pathologist in 1944, I believe. And so really people in Wisconsin got a good handle on understanding oak wilt early on. But it really is this disease that spreads by way of beetles that carry it from tree to tree, an infected tree to an uninfected tree, and then end up inoculating the tree. And a small spore germinates in the tree and then can grow and move through that vascular tissue. And as it does that, it clogs the tissue up, it occludes those tissues, prevents the tree from moving fluids like that have sugar in them, that have water, that have ions like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And those things then prevent the tree from moving these crucial fluids to the branches and to the leaves. And the tree really starts to succumb to a very rapid wilt or dehydration. So it's a wilt disease, and there are a few of them in the U.S., more than a few in the U.S. This is the one that's really hard on oaks, though.
So in a way, it's kind of like a tree's own kind of inflammatory disease type thing.
In some ways, yes, the tree will respond to the oak wilt disease by shedding its leaves early. Apparently, there's some kind of response by the tree to try to drop its leaves, and this isn't well understood, but this might be a little bit of a defensive mechanism, and there are parallels if you look at desert plants to when they are very short on soil moisture and it gets really times are tough for water, they'll start to shed their leaves, and it's doing plants do that because the leaves are the apparatus, the tissue part of the plant that's losing the water. So maybe if we can shed the leaves, we can then hunker down for a few months until the rains come back. But in the case of oak wilt, it's really that this disease is in the system and there's no way to stop it from continuing to move. So the shedding of leaves might be kind of an artifact of an evolutionary adaptation that just doesn't work in this case.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You were talking about how it kind of like spreads through beetles. Does the fungus like affect the beetles at all in any way?
No, it doesn't. It turns out that these beetles, there's about 8 to 10 species of them in Wisconsin that may be responsible for spreading oak wilt. And I say may be responsible because
it'd be pretty hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. Yeah, a lot of insects aren't well studied because there's maybe not an economic angle to study them. There hasn't been a lot of funding to do it, or they're fairly obscure and it takes a lot of time and effort to study them. But in any case, yeah, there's probably 8 to 9 that are believed to be part of the oak wilt disease cycle. And what they do is they end up feeding on this spore mat that the oak wilt disease will produce on an oak tree that it kills. And so these fungi or these beetles are simply going to feed and to congregate and kind of they mate a little bit and hang out on the spore mat that's got a really kind of fruity odor, but in so doing they're picking up oak wilt spores all along their body and their legs, and they then inadvertently transmit it to an injured oak if they visit that oak within about 48 hours of that fresh injury being made.
Are there certain kinds of oak trees that are more susceptible to it? Like a bur oak has thicker bark and stuff. Like, is it going to be less affected and harder to infect with the disease than like a red oak or something like that?
Yeah, there is. There is a spectrum of both susceptibility and a spectrum of tolerance to oak wilt among our native oak species here. So spectrum being very susceptible to not very susceptible. And the examples are oaks in the red oak group that include northern pin oak, black oak, and northern red oak. Those are all separate species, but in the red oak group are all highly susceptible to oak wilt infection and highly vulnerable if they are infected. They have no tolerance to it. There is really no instances where an oak tree that I know of hasn't died when it's contracted the disease, a red oak that hasn't died. But when we're talking about bur oaks are believed to have, and have shown, some research has shown they have kind of an intermediate resistance to oak wilt and an intermediate tolerance. They may not be as easily infected by the disease, and they might be able to somehow compartmentalize the disease if it gets into the system, where they might lose a portion of the crown or some of the branches, but maybe not the whole tree. White oak on the far end of the spectrum is believed to be quite a bit more resistant to infection from oak wilt and quite a bit more tolerant of it. And there are a lot of examples where a white oak may not end up getting infected with oak wilt, even if it were visited by one of these picnic beetles that's contaminated. And there's instances where the tree can survive because it's got a certain anatomy that allows it to wall off or compartmentalize portions of the limbs that got infected. So it's able to sort of stop and shut down that unchecked spread through those vessels in the tree.
So would that kind of be one way of like trying to control the spread, is taking out some of your more susceptible trees?
Yeah, that's a really good approach in some ways. Now, when we're talking about that, we're really kind of getting into like silvicultural level decisions. And silviculture is really the science and the art of deciding how to manage a forest for its composition and density and its different objectives. And so when we're talking about removing some of the red oak, that can definitely be a silviculture strategy to reduce the overall susceptibility and the amount of potential impact that could happen if oak wilt oak wilt were to get there. Now the question is, at what point in time does one try to remove the oak or promote a kind of a different stand composition? That
Yeah.
can be done at a few different stages. It can be done, of course, when you're initially planting a forest. You might say, well, I know oak wilt has become pretty common in, say, this county, say we're in Washburn or Sawyer County. Maybe I'm going to start a forest. I'm going to do some planting. Maybe I want to plant more white oak in there. Maybe I want to plant a little bit more swamp white oak rather than the pure northern red oak or northern pin oak. And that might be a really good approach to kind of reduce the density when you're planting. The other thing might be to, during the stage of doing forest thinning or some cutting, is to remove more of the red oak in favor, through the placement or retention of other species, favor some more of the white oak, favor some more of the sugar maple, favor some pine, so that they become a little bit more prominent in the future as those trees that are left behind, sugar maple, etc., produce more seed and can then fill in the forest underneath. So absolutely, I think in some ways, the more diversity we have in the forest as far as species, and the wider they're spread out, we're able to sort of get away from that high degree of vulnerability.
And doesn't oak wilt also spread through the root system? Like I remember reading a little bit about that.
Yeah, it does. And it's a really interesting feature of oak wilt, but it's not unique to oak wilt that it spreads through the root system. Quite a few diseases actually work this way. The way this works is that oaks growing within up to 100 feet of each other often will graft the roots together. And this happens as the tissues, the root tissues, come in contact over the many years that they might grow and eventually come into contact. And then those tissues actually fuse together, and they share fluid. They share the photosynthate fluid, they share the water and the minerals all together. This can actually be a real big benefit for trees, and there's been some research to show this can really help. If a tree is not doing as well, one individual, it can share resources, have some resources come to it. The problem is that, yes, it does create some vulnerability with the oak wilt disease, and that disease, so to oak wilt, in the form of both spores in the sap stream and also fungal mycelium, can move through that root graft system and move from oak to oak. And this is a very common pathway that we see with disease spread of oak wilt. What we usually talk about when we're talking about oak wilt impact is that oak wilt often gets to a new location, a new stand, by way of beetle vectoring, talking about maybe from stand to stand, maybe a third of a mile or so. But once it arrives in a stand, the vast majority of the impact, trees killed by the disease, comes through the below ground spread. So that's
I've heard that's kind of why it can be super difficult to control, is because it's like once it's in the area, it's like it's just going to start spreading through the root system, and there's almost like nothing you can really do about it. Is it so it won't spread through the roots to younger like oak saplings, right? Because they're not going to be connected to those older trees because they're just not developed as much.
It will kind of, yes, generally speaking, that's a good way of thinking about it, but there's always a little bit of nuance to these things, right? So it would depend on how far the young red oak sapling is away from the large mature red oak. Now, if it were within like 5-10 feet, it's conceivable that, that large tree has roots all over the place. And that the sapling would have connected. But if the sapling is quite a bit further away, maybe 40 feet away or even 20 feet, there's a good reason to think that the sapling may not have connected. We have seen in the environment roots of small trees like a sapling fuse to a larger tree when they're up to, I think, about 2 inches or so. It can happen at a fairly small diameter. So it can happen. It's less frequent though. And we do use that criterion, the size of the tree, to determine if there's a risk of that connection going on.
Are you able to do some sort of like just like guess in your head through like looking at the canopy of the tree and be like, okay, its root system will be like this much larger than its canopy or whatever, to kind of like try and guess like its roots are going to be this far and connect to these trees?
Absolutely, and there's some really good research that I don't even have to ballpark it really. I sometimes in the field I will ballpark it, but there's some really good research done by some forest health specialists and forest ecologists in Minnesota back in the 80s, and they looked at how how far out these trees graft to one another. And they did a bunch of exhaustive tests to determine that based on the diameter of a given oak tree, that is very predictive of how far out its root system goes.
Mm-hmm.
And so often, like when we're going to do an oak wilt control, which we'll talk about, or when we want to assess how far out one oak is from an infected one, and if that healthy tree could be vulnerable through the root graft spread, we can look at the diameter of both those trees, diameter being the spread of the tree across of both of them, and then look at a standardized table to determine if there is a 95% chance that the tree is in other words, grafted and at risk, or if it is not grafted and out. So
Interesting.
Yeah. So some of this work is really, we piggyback off of a lot of research already, which is really convenient for us when we're talking about oak wilt control.
Do you talk to a lot of, is there a lot of active research? That might be the first question. Is there a lot of active research with oak wilt? And then also, do you talk to a lot of those people that are doing that research?
Yeah, oak wilt is, because it's such a big economic issue and oaks are so crucial from a habitat and wildlife standpoint, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So researchers from University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, Michigan State, other institutions in the upper Midwest, even out in New York, look at oak wilt a lot in a lot of different, from a lot of different angles. And some of the examples I can give you just right now are some really good research that's come out of, UW-Madison in the last, I think it was 5 years ago. There was a fantastic study that looked at the growing degree days that are required before those beetles, the picnic beetles that spread oak wilt, will start to emerge in the spring. And they looked at, well, based on these growing degree days, we can maybe make a model and determine any given year, based on how many heat units we have, when the likely time is that these beetles would start to emerge and thus create risk of spreading the disease. There's other work being done right now looking at how to detect oak. This is out of the University of Minnesota, how to detect oak wilt using satellite imagery. So we can maybe in an isolated forest, or a forest that be really hard to drive a UTV through, or it's just too big to walk, we might be able to use some of that remote sensing, aerial remote sensing, to determine if there's an oak wilt infection that we could maybe do some control on. And we do talk to these researchers quite a lot. The study from Madison, we helped our program, the Wisconsin DNR Forest Health Program, helped fund that study, and we got a really cool tool out of it too. We got this interactive model that people can use, anyone, the public can use on our website, where they can determine if based on the spring weather they've seen, it's maybe April 28th, and they wonder, is oak wilt high risk at this point? We've had awfully cold temperatures. It's April 28th. Usually they say April 15th, we should stop cutting oaks. Then they go onto this tool and they find that based on the cool weather they've had that spring, the likelihood that the beetles have emerged is actually very low. So that tells them there's a little bit more time to do some of your spring cleanup, or there's a little bit more time to finish that forest thinning that the logging contractor was working on. So too, the tool can be used in an opposite manner, where it might say, hey, we've had some really warm weather this April. Usually we say stop cutting, pruning, or wounding oaks by April 15th. But in this particular case, it's been so warm, hypothetically, that they go onto the tool on April 5th and they see that, oh my God, the risk of oak wilt is now high. It all of a sudden switched overnight because we've reached the threshold of heat units sufficient to allow the picnic beetles to emerge. So that was research that we helped fund, and now we have this fantastic tool. There's other examples where we really talk to these researchers. There's a meeting that happens. There was one this August. It happened over in Michigan, where a whole lot of researchers from Michigan State and private contractors who work with oak wilt all the time get together in what's called the Oak Wilt Managers Workshop. So during that time, there's a bunch of indoor sessions presenting research on the disease, presenting on control methods that different private contractors have tried to use, different kind of stumbling blocks that they run into So giving some of us, people who are also practitioners, but also communicators, more rules of thumb and advice on how to conduct some of this work. And then also field days where they went out to the field and looked at Oak Wilt and talked about control there. So yes, a high degree of communication between researchers and what we do on the health team to inform and give the best scientifically backed advice that we can to people.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does it only affect oak trees?
It actually affects chestnut trees too. Oak wilt can kill chestnut trees, but it's pretty much a moot point here because we don't have chestnuts in Wisconsin other than a small stand in, I guess, West Salem, east of La Crosse. Chestnut used to be common, but it got wiped out by a different disease, the chestnut blight. So effectively, yeah, it's just an oak disease at this point, and really primarily the red oak is the red oak group is the main one that's under pressure by this disease.
Do we have an idea as to why that is?
Well, it might be that when it comes to the red oak versus the white oak, we know anatomically why the white oaks are a little bit more resistant to it, and it has to do with this feature in those cells. Think of these vessels that move water in a tree as like straws that are stacked vertically onto one another, and these are cells, but they're like straws, and that's how the tree's moving the water. But on the ends of these straws, with oaks, they don't really have any stop valve at all. It's just one straw after the other, and there's a free flowing kind of opening between these stacked cells. But in the case of white oak, there's a little feature there called a tylose, and it is almost like a valve that can stop the flow between those stacked straws or stacked cells. And when the tree senses, my understanding is when it can somehow sense that it's being attacked or there's a foreign body in it, it can kind of shut off one cell from the other and kind of create that isolation or compartmentalization effect. And so that's why, that is the case. Why it doesn't affect other species beyond that, it must be that oak wilt was really evolved to be a specialist of oak trees, would be my guess. And that's not always the case. Many tree diseases are pretty specific to a species. Dutch elm disease, for example, is pretty specific to elm. But when it comes to insects, which I work a lot with, they are not often as specific. We have some highly specialized ones, but we have ones that are more general that'll go after an array of different tree species, like the whole pine group, or they'll go after the whole ash group, or this or that. So
Interesting. What's kind of like the origins of oak wilt? Is it native to this continent, or is it from European origins?
That's a good question. The short answer is we don't really know for sure, but the most current lines of evidence point toward it's likely an invasive species, and most likely from Central or South America. And that's based on the fact that historically there wasn't a wide incidence of oak wilt. Like I said earlier, we had the first kind of what sort of researchers thought might have been oak wilt back in the late 1890s, when there were, in the government government land office notes, what were described as patches of dead oak trees growing in various places in Wisconsin that couldn't really have been explained by anything probably other than oak wilt, or oak wilt seemed to be a likely candidate for having caused something like that. But that was relatively recent, and there wasn't a lot of that. And since then, it's really spread a lot further north, where we have now detections in most of the northern counties, Washburn, Douglas, Bayfield, Ashland, all the way up north. And that wasn't always the case. There wasn't really any known records up here. So the fact that it's continuing to expand up north suggests that, it probably started out somewhere in the south, like southeast of the U.S., where it was thought to begin, and then it moved up, and it wasn't really native to the area. The other thing is, when we look at, some of the researchers have looked at the genetics of oak wilt and the different kind of populations through population analysis, and they're all pretty similar, is my understanding. There's not a lot of genetic variety between the populations, which could suggest kind of a population, what we call in genetics or ecology, a bottleneck, where there was an introduced population of the disease, but it really didn't have many other strains or populations to regenerate with. And so there's kind of a lot of genetic similarity. And and invasives tend to have that a little bit more, more of a bottleneck or really tight genetic variability.
Okay.
So that's another thing. And then there's this other thing, if I can describe this. Oak wilt is it's like it's considered a true wilt disease. It's the only one like it in the US that has, like, it forms this kind of mat that forms on the inside of the bark and pops it open. And Dutch elm disease isn't quite like that. It doesn't work that way. It's just like biologically, it's very different. It's not considered kind of a true wilt, whereas oak wilt is considered a true wilt. So there's enough differences to make the researchers think it's probably non-native and they for some reason thinks maybe South America.
Okay. That's kind of interesting because, like, do you know if there's many oak trees in South America?
I would think so. My guess is probably, it seems kind of counterintuitive because it's a little bit more of like a rainforest type situation there. But oaks are, what I know of oaks is they're a very diverse group of trees, and they're very widespread, all the way from Canada down to the southeast, and then down into South America, where they are just there's a very, very many variety and diversity of them.
Yeah. And you touched on this a little bit, but like, where, in terms of like the United States, like, where is oak wilt as far as its spread, and how quickly did it spread across?
Yeah, so if you look at a map right now, you would see, like, looking at Texas, oak wilt has spread across many, many counties in Texas, and mostly in the eastern part, where you actually have a lot of oaks in Texas, in particular live oak. It's been a really big problem in that type of ecosystem. But all the way up from Texas into Oklahoma, into Iowa and Missouri and Illinois, Minnesota, all the way up to Wisconsin, in that Midwestern band, really pretty common there. And then also it's becoming more common in the far Northeast. Like, I think New York State had its first statewide detection just about 4 years ago. And I think the second year after the first year of detection, I think they had 2 new counties the following year. So kind of like, wow, maybe this was here for a while and we didn't
see it.
Yeah. So I'd say the core would be, Texas all the way up through the heart of the Midwest into the upper Great Lakes region, and then now spotting into the far Northeast in New York State.
It's not really spreading west at all, though?
Not too much. From the maps I've looked at, it's not really too far out west at this point. For example, I'm seeing, Pennsylvania, New York, and then actually, Indiana, Ohio, just kind of that core. I'd say maybe that core of the central Texas on up to the central Midwest, upper Midwest, and then the Northeast on up to grading into New York State now.
Okay. Do you think, like, and maybe you don't know the answer to this question, this is kind of just me like prying a little bit. You think that would be more to the case of why it's not moving west, more oak tree based, or do you think it's more beetle based? Like, do you think it's due to the density of the oak trees, or is it the beetles not being able to like cross the Mississippi or whatever?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I think that might have something to do with it, where we have what's called, there's a name for it, I can't remember, but it's kind of a little bit of a tree desert as we cross and get west of the Mississippi further, and we get into the Dakotas. There's really this big stretch of plains that break up the forest. And then if you look, you kind of have like this area in the Intermountain West where, sure, you might have a few oaks, but they're not that common. It's much more conifer dominated in the mountain landscapes. So I would think it's largely both a disjunction of the habitat, where you have this big span of territory without infectable oaks because it's fairly sparse. And then when you do get out there, it's very low oak density. So I would think, we call that host density, is probably playing a role in that as well.
Cool. So then now we can probably start getting into like the management practices of it. So with I briefly did research on Oak Wilt. I'm over in Vernon County, so a county below La Crosse County. And it's kind of an area where it's just like dominantly oaks in your woods and stuff. So that's like something that I'm worried about with managing our property, is like if Oak Wilt's here, and if it is, like what to do about it. So I was like researching like what to do about it and stuff. And I kept just finding like contact your local forester and come up with a management plan. And also I was finding it's very expensive.
Yeah.
So like, say I hire a local forester or whatever, like what is he going to tell me to do?
Yeah. So it's going to kind of depend on like what your resources are generally, if you have some equipment available to you, if you have some know-how, and then how dense the oaks are on the site, and what kind of structures and topography might be involved. So if we're talking about driftless area, I'm guessing we've got a lot of hills in the mix here. Yep. We've got it's a lot of contiguous oaks. A couple of things to know backing up to the biology is that when oaks grow on hilly sites where the soil's pretty rich, the spread rates are not as high. The spread rates are not as quick. And by that, I mean, they're not as quick, and they don't tend to the root grafting doesn't go out as far.
By spread rate, you mean roots, right?
Spread rate, like as in the amount of trees killed per year once we have an infection.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it has to do with the root connections. So where we see the fastest spread rates in contrast would be on flat terrain where it's really sandy. So really sandy sites where it's really flat tend to encourage very prominent lateral root growth. And so we see examples of that like in the central sands of Wisconsin, like down near, Jackson County and Adams County, and up in northwest Wisconsin as well. But where you are, the encouraging thing is that because it's so hilly and because the soils are so rich, those root systems aren't going to spread out as far. They tend to be a little bit more compact. And so you might have trees, or you might have, say, an infected oak that is, it's infected, but it may not be connected to a healthy oak if it's like 30 to 40 feet away. Whereas on a flat site, it might be connected when it's up to 60 or 70 feet away. So you get this compacted effect. That's really good. So we would want to understand that on your site. We would want to account for that hilliness in the richer type of soil. Secondarily, we would look at, can we get any equipment into the site? If it's really steep, maybe it wouldn't be appropriate. So when we think about oak wilt control, this is the premise here. We're talking about two things of control. We know we have diseased wood. A tree that gets killed by oak wilt will generally produce a spore mat the following spring, and that can be a real problem. So the first part of disease management is managing what we call the spore producing trees. That's item one. Item two is the below ground spread. So let's focus on below ground spread in your case. Let's say we have a group of trees on your property that you determined had oak wilt. Let's say the way you determined that they had oak wilt was you looked at some photos, you talked to the forest health specialist, you got an eye for what oak wilt looks like, you walked out and surveyed the woods in around the early part of August, you saw leaves falling down from the tree very precipitously and abruptly. So all these oak leaves falling, and you notice next to the tree that was losing these leaves that there were two other dead trees that had no leaves on them. That is going to tell you, bingo, that might be an oak wilt infection there. I have what appears to be a developing pocket, so contiguous set of trees that are either dead or dying, and I have a freshly wilting tree. So then what we would do is we would mark out those three trees in this case with some flagging ribbon so we can identify the oak wilt epicenter. That's our epicenter. There we have to then take the diameter of each of those three trees that's in that center point, And we then have to write down what their diameter is. I usually write down the diameter on the ribbon on each of the trees.
Sure.
And then I go around usually like a 60 to 80 foot radius, and I measure any of the red oaks that are within that radius of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
I would then look at my table as I go through each of them. I have this table, it's online on our fact sheet, and I would determine based on the distance this healthy oak is from one of those three oaks, is it within this critical distance on the chart, or is it outside the critical distance? And if it's within the critical distance, it means that it's likely to be root grafted to that tree.
Yeah.
And so once I determine all the trees that are in or root grafted based on my chart, I would give them a flagging ribbon, mark them out, and then we have to, this creates our risk zone. These are called our buffer trees in our risk zone. So we have a bunch of different options we can employ on these trees. One of them is if we have flat topography, which in your case we don't, we would take a trencher or a vibratory plow and dig a 5-foot trench, 5-foot deep trench around the outside of those buffer trees that we know are root grafted. They're not dead yet. They look healthy and asymptomatic, but we know if we do nothing, they will get oak wilt. So we take the 5-foot trencher and we wrap a whole circle around. Well, with 3 large trees in your stand, this could now include potentially 20 oak trees.
Yeah.
So the pocket could be big. Now, that's kind of a bummer, but that's kind of how this is. If we can't get the vibratory plow or trencher, the other options we can rely on are herbicide treatments.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been working with the tribal foresters at Menominee Tribal Forest Enterprises, as well as Stockbridge Muncie and the Forest Service. And there's been this method that's been developed that's kind of a real low key and low cost method instead of doing vibratory plow. And it's called herbicide barrier. So we've got our trees, the buffer trees marked out. What we would do then is we could do one of two things. We could come back and we could chainsaw girdle all of those buffer trees. We would girdle them at 2 points, about 6 inches off the ground, and then a second girdle 6 inches above
and
that.
Girdle, to those that don't know, is just like a ring around the tree that's like, what, 2 inches deep into it?
About an inch deep, yep. Ring the tree with a chainsaw, 2 locations, 6 inches up from the ground, 6 inches from that, and then spray into the cuts immediately or within an hour or so. A heavy duty brush herbicide that we spray from a pump sprayer or a backpack sprayer. Okay. And what we're doing is we're effectively trying to kill these healthy asymptomatic oaks or cause sufficient root disruption so that they're not working the way they otherwise would. And if we can kill all of them fairly quickly, like if they die quickly from the herbicide, it sets up like a barrier, a biological barrier around it where the oak wilt can't spread through dead trees. So we created a dead tree wall around it.
Yeah.
The other option,
you're kind of just like fighting fire with fire in a way. It's like you're pre-burning or pre-removing the stuff so it can't get past that barrier.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And the other option we could do is we could simply cut those trees down, those buffer trees or so that are around the 3 infected ones, and spray that same herbicide to the stump. So that way you don't have to let the tree kind of be girdled and half kind of cut and standing. It can be very good for wildlife, birds and stuff, woodpeckers. Love trees that are standing, but if you're by a structure, it could be a safety hazard. So there's that variant we could use, and we've been doing that method a lot and recommending it a lot in the right situations, and had pretty good success with it. What we find is that when there's less than 4 infected trees involved, when we set up these herbicide barriers, the containment rate is about 65%. So it's a little bit better than half that we won't get a breakout. When we go more than 4 trees, the efficacy rate drops down to about 29%. So it's not as good. And so we also want to really be thinking, how many infected trees do we have here to determine what the best containment measure is? Yeah.
And you're like, fungicides don't really affect oak wilt, or is it more of like you're just trying to kill the trees so it stops spreading through the roots instead of actually targeting the fungus disease?
Yeah, fungicides are a fantastic tool, but they really have a limited and narrow application. And here's the application where we would use a fungicide for oak wilt. Say we've got a urban tree growing in someone's yard or growing at the yard of the state capitol, and it's a very stately, high value tree. That is a tree that we might employ preventative fungicide injections on every couple of years to prevent it from ever getting oak wilt.
Yeah.
Then the other option would be if we've got oak wilt in that same yard, say in the courtyard on the Capitol, we've got one infected red oak next to another one that we've determined is root grafted. So, boy, if we don't do anything, we know this other huge 150-year-old tree is going to die. That's a case where you would use fungicide injections to protect that tree from getting killed from oak wilt. And the reason we can't really use these fungicides effectively to stop and create that firewall out in the woods that we were talking about with the herbicide barrier is because if we were to take all those trees that we herbicided and instead inject them with fungicide to create a wall, it's been shown that oak wilt can actually spread through the root system of a fungicided tree. It's weird. You're like, well, you think why wouldn't oak wilt? It's spreading to the tree that you gave fungicide. Why wouldn't the fungicide stop it from moving in? And B, well, wouldn't it kill the tree then?
Yeah.
It's actually really weird because it turns out that oak wilt doesn't. The fungal disease doesn't actually clog up the tissues and cause that dehydration unless it moves to the above ground portion of the tree, the stem that we see and everything above. The fungus somehow keeps the disease at bay. It keeps it below the soil surface so it can't get into the stem. And so what we would have in that case in your forest, if we use the fungicides, is we would put fungicide in all those trees and we'd protect them for a couple of years, and we could keep doing it every 2 years.
But it's still active in the root system.
It would still be active, and then oak wilt could get outside of that barrier, and then you might see trees starting to die beyond the buffer zone. So it's this weird biology where it can kind of hack the system, this disease, and still hang out and get through. So that's why we never really talk about or think about the fungicides as an actual containment measure.
Yeah.
More of a keep the tree alive measure, keep the tree protected measure, but can't stop it with it necessarily from moving around.
Yeah. Is there like a certain thought process of just like letting oak wilt take its course through your property or whatever, and then just like reseeding oak trees into your property? Like the downside of that is like if you're around us, like we have a lot of 150-year-old, maybe even a handful of 200-year-old oak trees. Like I don't want to lose those trees. I kind of want to keep those guys.
This is such a good question. It really brings me back to part of the reason I got into this profession. My parents own a property probably a lot like yours, and it had a lot of oak on it. And back in the 90s, oak wilt moved through the forest, and it killed the majority of the oaks in this 40-acre parcel. It was really sad to see, and we didn't really do a whole lot about it because I don't think we understood it at the time so well. And so we cut a lot of the firewood out, and we burned it for firewood. What ended up growing back in that particular case was a lot of red maple, and a lot of red maple grew back, and also pen sedge. And so that was an example where, not doing management ultimately and letting nature take its course with the advanced regeneration that was already present was okay, but the habitat was somewhat degraded. Pen sedge it's a type of native sedge. It's sort of like a grass. It grows in the understory, but it really crowds out a lot of the native flora, crowds out wildflowers and other plants that would be pretty beneficial. And it also doesn't allow a lot of trees to regenerate because it creates such a thick mass. Meanwhile, red maple, we know, doesn't produce the mass that an oak does to feed turkey and to feed squirrel and to feed deer. So from a wildlife benefit standpoint, it's not as good. So that was an example where, that was unfortunate to see so many of those trees die, and then the forest kind of just let it take its trajectory as it did. So I think there's a lot of opportunity when oaks are killed if one were to take a passive approach like you're talking about, it could be very good depending on what's already there and depending on what interventions you might do, such as underplanting, to kind of promote a new diversity and a new stand composition or supplement the composition in there. And that could lead to a really good outcome if it was done in a kind of a maybe not necessarily well planned, but a way that put some thought into it, absolutely. And we know for sure, as these oak trees die, and a lot of them, not a lot, but a few of them that died, there's probably a dozen in that forest I'm talking about that are still standing. They're these old legacy snags, and they look really, I think snags look really cool. And I know that they're really beneficial to wildlife, woodpeckers, and other avians. So having them there is really a habitat benefit, and those things can be a good thing to have. So yeah, passive approach isn't something to shy away from. If you give it, if you know the potential risks, and you put in some thought on how you can also intervene in a productive and constructive way in that forest.
Yeah, I think the kind of some of the benefits to that is if you're someone that like wants like good wildlife flow through your property and stuff, you can do more of the planning and designing for that. Like that can sometimes be appealing to people. What about like, so one thing around here in the Driftless area is like prairie and oak savanna. I feel like that would probably really reduce the spread of oak wilt, just because it's like you're going to have oak trees that are 40, 60 feet away from each other, and you might be able to catch it earlier on and just kill that tree, and it's not going to spread to the roots.
That's exactly right. Yeah, having that discontinuity or low oak density will really improve the odds that any of the oaks around it will survive, because we won't have unchecked spread in that case. And then also, these knitted beetles or picnic beetles, they can fly a third of a mile, but having a little bit sparser density means that there's going to be less inoculum in the area. And so oak trees aren't going to be quite as easy to access for them to end up infecting as they move and rove around. So absolutely, the prairie country is going to be in a better position, and savanna country better position to have reduced oak wilt incidents.
Yeah. The only thing is it's not really a thing anymore, but
it is a very imperiled ecosystem, isn't it?
Yeah. It's something like I want to do like on our property is definitely like lots of prairie work and maybe like some oak savanna recovery as well. Like I think that'd be really cool to have on our property.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that same thing for our family property, because we have currently an area that's planted in cash crops and rented out to a farmer. But I think it would be such a fantastic area to plant into a prairie. And there's already this old kind of oak. It's not really savanna, but it's like a red oak island out there that never got tilled. It's kind of growing out there. And I think adding some other oaks in that, it's about a 40-acre savanna. Well, it could be a savanna.
Yeah.
It would be so cool. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking the same. And these are like 5 to 15 year types of visions,
Oh yeah.
But,
I mean,
but they can be done.
Prairie alone takes a really long time to come in, but then you add the oaks in there as well, and particularly like bur oaks, they're just like slow growing trees, I feel like, and it's like it takes a while for it to take effect, but it's like it could be some of the best stuff for your soil and your wildlife.
Yeah, it really would, and it's just those are such beautiful like environments to have recreational space, like as in a hike or birding, or going out and finding some peace, a sense of solace after a busy week or something.
Yeah, for sure. My last thing that I have for you is like identification. How do you kind of just like tell? It's kind of hard to describe through words. It'd be helpful if we had pictures up here and stuff, but like how do you identify maybe symptoms?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we probably should have talked about that earlier, but hey, here we go. So oak wilt is one of the more easy diseases to recognize, because there are virtually no other tree insect pest or diseases that cause the leaves to fall off rapidly in the middle of the summer, usually about July 15th through September. So what we would look for is if we see a rapid leaf drop on a red oak, that's very telltale. as you inspect these leaves that have fallen, if you were to see around the edge of the leaf, we call it the margin, a darker or brown kind of slight area on the edge, whereas the midrib or center part of the leaf still looks green, and there's a very sharp edge between those two. The brown where it meets the green is very stark. Some would even call it like a water-soaked appearance, from brown grading abruptly into green. That would be very telltale of oak wilt. Virtually nothing else will cause the leaf to have that appearance. So rapid leaf drop, leaves that have a brown margin in green midrib, and then also looking for the symptoms of the leaf drop, usually from the top of the crown down, is the way it unfolds. That's where it's hardest to get water, the upper portions of the crown. They're furthest away from the roots, the water source. So that's where the symptoms will show up first. Top of the crown and outside branches, and then it kind of moves inward and downward, and this all ensues, these leaf drop, over the course of about a month and a half. So very quick. If you were to come back a week later, you would definitely see progression. If you're not sure, come back a week later, see progression. Once we think we have an oak wilt tree, really good idea to test for the oak wilt disease. And what we recommend is that if landowners own a parcel of land, like 10, 20 acre plus, call the forest health specialist or local DNR office. There may be assistance where we can come and do free, collect a sample and do free testing to determine, based on lab results. We use kind of high-end DNA tests, PCR tests, to determine oak wilt. Usually we could have that tested for you. If it's a urban tree or kind of more of a yard situation, there's what's called the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic down at Madison, where you can collect a sample, homeowners can, and send it in to have it tested for a fairly small fee. It's like $25. And they turn around the results in a couple weeks. And then once you have that positive diagnosis, then you'll have you'll have the core information you need to actually start planning potential management. The other thing with identification in a forest setting, anytime we have groups of oaks that are dead growing next to each other, that is very suggestive. That warrants a closer look. And so what I'd recommend landowners do is if they ever see patches of dead oaks, to flag it. Don't just assume you'll be able to, unless you know your woods very well, or you can take a GPS point. Actually take a GPS point on your phone, probably, because you might not have flagging tape with you when you see it. Try to remember where that is. Go back in when you can and see if you can collect a sample from it, or call a forest health specialist to come out and take a look and collect a wood sample and have tested. So pockets of dead trees, rapid leaf loss, leaves that have that brown halo on the edge in green center, and also know that testing is available. If you own a large piece of land, DNR can help. If you don't, you can still call DNR. We can help and guide you in collecting your own sample to send to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic.
Is it like pretty encouraged, like if you have any suspicions at all of oak wilt, that you should contact your forester? Or is it like once you're like pretty certain it's oak wilt, you just want to make sure, then call them?
Yeah, I would say if it's really going to be a forest setting where there's some management at play here, and we really want to try to protect the resource more at like a more of a multi-tree level, that's definitely a good phone call. If it's your yard tree, or you've got a couple of patches, you already know you had oak wilt, and you've got the know-how now, you've had the rundown. You don't have to let us know about it. We're really here as like, let's get you set up with what you need to do to empower you to do the good stewardship on your property that you can.
Cool. I lied earlier. I have two more related questions. I think we maybe touched on this a little bit, but like, how quickly does it kill oak trees, and then how quickly does it spread?
Yeah. So when it comes to killing them, what we usually see is that a tree might get the high risk period for oak wilt spread is generally in the northern half of the state, April 15th to July 15th. So during that time frame, we recommend loggers, homeowners, anyone doing trail maintainers of snowmobile trails and roads, do no cutting, wounding, or pruning of oaks during that time frame. The reason is because beetles that spread it have the highest populations during those months, April through July, and also because oak wilt spore mats that produce those spores are most common. So oaks are very susceptible during that time. Usually, once a tree is injured, it's got about a 48-hour window before that wound it is no longer susceptible. It dries out, it gets more acidic, there's chemical changes, and the disease can't really take after that. So you better hope that if you have an injured oak, it doesn't get visited by one of these beetles within 48 hours. But if it does, say it's mid-June, what we would tend to think is that if the tree's infected in mid-June, we would expect it would start dying and wilting probably sometime in August. Usually there's about a month, maybe month and a half delay between when it's infected and we might see symptom onset. Once symptom onset happens, though, when we start to see leaves start to kind of shrink a little bit and start dropping, then most of the crown loses its leaves within a month and a half. So, in Georgia, it's the fastest moving disease in oaks that we have in North America. It's the most destructive. It's kind of the most aggressive too.
Yeah.
So month and a half from infection to onset, month and a half from onset to virtually no leaves left on the tree.
Okay. And where does it, like we talked a little bit about before we started recording, of like it's a hot topic right now. Where does it rank in like tree diseases and stuff, of like importance of like people knowing about it, management knowing about it, research on it, compared to like other diseases?
What fascinates me is that in spite of all we know about oak wilt, to those questions, it still gets not renewed interest, but kind of a continued interest among researchers. And that momentum really hasn't faded. And I think it just keeps coming back to, here we are, for example, in Northwest Wisconsin. If we look at a tree composition map, we can see that oaks are everywhere up here. They're not everywhere, but they're so common in the northern forest. They're really common in the Northwest Sands, and there's a lot of economic. They're an economic foundation of the forest products industry. They're a wildlife and a food source driver for wildlife populations, and they're also like very long-lived aesthetic type of tree that people want to have around. They love oak, and so that's why there's such a momentum to continue to study it. How it would rank, I would say, among other hardwood diseases would definitely be within the top 5 in the upper Great Lakes. For sure. Maybe in the top 3 even. And then, it's just constantly people are looking at it in new ways and just trying to learn more, trying to refine our techniques with the control, trying to detect it more quickly and get on top of it. And then with it being a hot topic now, we put out a press release usually December or January, about now that winter has arrived. Winter is the best time to prune your oak trees. Yeah. Of course, people think, hey, they get back up to their cabin or their second home in the spring. They need to do some cleanup because the snow knocks some limbs down. And, there's a broken limb. I think I'm going to try to cut it clean. Great idea. But if we're talking about an oak and it's past April or April 15th, not a good idea. So that's where we really try to get this message out. Like, now that winter has come, and now that all the pests and diseases are sort of dormant for this time, it's a really good time to get that tree work done so that these trees can get their nice pruning done or trimming or cutting that needs to happen without the undue risk of oak wilt spread. So this is why kind of a good time to chat about it too. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's a great conversation. Your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, I appreciate it, George. And if there's any other topics that come to mind in the future, let me know. I'd be happy to join again.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.